The Great Hall of the Galactic Council was a massive place filled with lights and colors from 100 different worlds. Banners of alien nations hung from the high curved walls, their strange shapes glowing with symbols that no human eye could easily read. The air carried the low hum of translation machines, turning dozens of alien voices into a language all could understand. Long tables formed a wide circle around the center stage where the delegates stood when it was their turn to speak, and above them the ceiling was a dome of clear crystal showing the stars, and a nearby gas giant swirling with orange and white storms. The meeting was about peace treaties between many species, trade routes, and new defense rules for border worlds. The humans had sent their diplomats as usual, wearing formal uniforms with simple designs compared to the grand robes and shimmering armor of other races. They sat quietly, their faces calm and unreadable, watching the debates unfold with patience that some mistook for weakness. On this day, the speaker from the Croth Empire stepped forward, his tall frame covered in a scaled cloak made from the hide of some great beast from his homeworld. His eyes were narrow slits glowing faintly red. His mouth curved into something between a grin and a snarl, and when he spoke his voice was deep and sharp, like the crack of a whip. He began by praising the council for its efforts to maintain peace, but then his tone shifted, and he looked directly at the human delegation with a smirk, his claws tapping on the edge of the podium, the sound echoing through the quiet chamber. "You humans," he said in a voice thick with amusement, "speak of peace as if it is your highest virtue. You claim to value life above all else, and yet you call yourselves warriors. But I have studied your history. I have seen your so-called battles, and I tell you this. There is no true warrior spirit in you." The words rolled across the hall, carried by the translators into every ear, and a few of the other alien delegates chuckled softly. Some covered their mouths with long fingers or tentacles to hide their amusement. Others exchanged glances that said they agreed with the Croth. He continued, each sentence striking like a blade. "You fight from a distance, you hide behind machines and weapons. You fear the closeness of real battle. Your soldiers are soft, your people are soft. You have no hunger for glory, no taste for the kill. You wage war like merchants bargaining for goods, safe and clean and far from the blood." A ripple of laughter moved around the hall, not loud but sharp, and it stung the air like cold wind. The human diplomats remained still, their hands folded neatly on the table, their eyes fixed on the speaker, but their silence seemed to feed his boldness, making him stand taller, making his grin wider. "Even in your greatest wars," he said, "you fought only because you had no choice. When the fight was over, you rushed back to your homes and your comforts. A true warrior lives for the fight. A true warrior dreams of the next battle. But you dream of safety, of peace, of quiet lives. You do not understand the honor of the blade." This time the laughter was louder, filling the great hall with strange sounds from many different throats, clicking, hissing, rumbling, and even a few high-pitched trills. The banners above swayed slightly in the gentle air currents from the vents, and the stars beyond the crystal dome seemed to watch in silent judgment. The human ambassador shifted slightly in his seat, his face calm, but his eyes narrowing just enough for those close to notice. A young aide sitting beside him clenched her hands under the table, her jaw tight, but she said nothing. The rules of the council gave the floor to one speaker at a time, and to interrupt was to risk insult on a galactic stage. The Croth delegate leaned forward now, his claws gripping the podium, his voice dropping to a slow, mocking rhythm. "Perhaps this is why you seek these treaties so eagerly. Perhaps this is why you bow so quickly to the idea of peace, because deep inside you know that you cannot stand against the real warriors of the galaxy, not in open combat, not in a battle where the weak fall first and the strong feast on victory." More laughter followed, joined by nods from a few delegates wearing heavy armor or carrying weapons at their sides. They looked at the humans as if seeing prey that had wandered into the den of hunters. The sound of it filled every corner of the hall and rolled like a wave across the human table. Near the end of the human row, half hidden in the shadow of a tall alien seated beside him, sat a man who did not wear the crisp suit of a diplomat. His clothes were simpler, an old service uniform, faded at the edges, decorated with ribbons and badges that most of the aliens did not recognize. The cloth was worn but clean, his boots polished though scarred by use, his hair was gray, cut short, and a thin line of a scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. He had been silent through the entire meeting, his eyes watching not just the cloth speaker, but the faces of every delegate in the room, as if studying them one by one. The lines on his face spoke of long years and harder days, and the way he sat was not the way of a man at rest, but of a man waiting for something. When the laughter swelled again, he shifted in his chair, a small movement but enough to draw the glance of the young aide beside him. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words died when she saw the look in his eyes. There was no anger there, no flash of pride wounded by insult, only a steady calm, like a deep river before a storm. The cross speaker ended his remarks with one final jab. So let the humans sign their papers and make their promises. Let them believe it will keep them safe. But if the day comes when the galaxy must fight again, they will stand behind the rest of us, or they will fall. As the sound of alien amusement faded, a strange quiet settled over the hall. The human diplomats remained still, but at the far end of their table the gray-haired man rose slowly to his feet. The movement was unhurried, but every eye in the hall turned to watch, as if something in the air had changed. The laughter stopped completely, replaced by a silence that seemed to stretch and tighten like a drawn bow. The man rose from his chair with the slow certainty of someone who had done this before, not here in the polished council hall surrounded by alien banners and glittering light, but in places where the air smelled of smoke and metal, where the ground trembled from distant fire. His boots touched the floor with a heavy sound that seemed to travel farther than it should. The faint whisper of cloth moving as he straightened his back was somehow louder in the sudden silence than the buzzing of the translation drones above. The human diplomats on either side shifted slightly to make space, their eyes following him as he stepped into the open space behind their row, every movement precise, his shoulders square, his chin lifted, the light from the great crystal dome catching on the faded colors of his uniform. There were medals on his chest, not large or shining like the golden crests of alien generals, but small, dark with age, each one carrying weight unseen by those who did not know their story. He began to walk toward the center floor, the sound of his steps echoing in the vast chamber, not hurried, not hesitant, each one landing with the same measured force. Alien eyes followed him, some narrow and suspicious, others curious. The cross speaker froze with his claws still resting on the podium, his faint grin faltering just enough for those watching closely to notice. No one called out for him to stop. Perhaps they expected him to take a seat at one of the open speaking stations. Perhaps they thought he would make a quiet request to respond to the insult. But instead he kept walking, moving directly toward the center of the wide circle, where only appointed speakers stood, his gaze fixed not on the cloth, but on the open floor ahead, as though it was already his. The council guards, tall figures in silver armor from a neutral world, shifted on their feet, their hands resting on the shafts of their ceremonial spears. They looked at each other, unsure if they should block his way. But something in his expression made them hesitate. The set of his jaw, the way his eyes never wavered, the quiet confidence of someone who feared nothing in the room. When he reached the circle, he stopped, turning slowly until he faced the entire gathering, his hands resting lightly behind his back. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but carried with perfect clarity through the chamber, picked up by the drones and woven into the ears of every listener in their own tongue. "I heard what you said," he began, his tone calm as still water. "And I thought about staying quiet. I thought about letting my people respond in the way diplomats do, with careful words and polite faces, but there are some things that cannot be left unanswered." The cross speaker tilted his head, a flicker of his earlier amusement returning. But he said nothing, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man before him. Other delegates leaned forward, the shifting sound of many bodies in the vast chamber like dry leaves rustling in a sudden wind. "You said humans have no warrior spirit," the man continued. "You said we hide behind machines, that we fear the closeness of battle, that we do not live for the fight. Maybe you believe that because you have only seen what we allow you to see." He took a single step forward, and though it was small, it seemed to close a distance far greater than the space between him and the cross. "I'm not here to change your mind with numbers or history books. I am here to tell you a truth that you will not forget. Not because I want to boast, not because I want to threaten, but because it is something you must understand. His eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of a dozen alien species, from the chitin-armored Thax to the feathered diplomats of Varys. There's a reason humans seek peace, a reason we make treaties and build walls between ourselves and war. And it is not because we are weak, it is because we know what we are when the fighting begins, we know what we become. A murmur spread through the hall, faint and uneasy, like a cold breeze slipping through cracks in a closed door. The man let it pass without speaking, waiting until the sound faded before he continued. You call yourselves warriors because you fight for glory, for honor, for the joy of the clash. We fight for something else. We fight for survival. And when survival is on the line, there is nothing we will not do. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the air itself. The alien delegates who had laughed earlier now sat with their eyes fixed on him, their expressions harder to read, some tense, some thoughtful. The Croth shifted his claws away from the podium and folded his arms, as if settling in to listen against his will. You look at our machines and think they make us soft, the man said, but those machines are built by hands that know how to bleed. They're commanded by minds that have seen friends fall and keep moving forward. Our weapons are tools, not crutches, and if they break, we will use whatever is left, and if nothing is left, we will use our own bodies. The young human aide in the diplomats row sat with her hands clenched tight, her heart pounding as the words filled the chamber. She had seen the ribbons on his chest, but she had never heard him speak like this. The measured way he spoke felt like footsteps approaching something dangerous, each one bringing the listeners closer whether they wanted to follow or not. The man let a moment of silence grow, drawing the eyes of every listener into that pause, before he said in a voice that was almost quiet, "You are lucky, all of you, that we prefer peace, that we avoid war when we can, because if we did not, the galaxy would remember us not for treaties, not for trade, but for the day we stopped holding back." The council hall felt smaller somehow. The banners still hung in their proud rows. The stars still shone beyond the dome. But the space between every heartbeat seemed wider. The guards at the edges of the chamber stood a little straighter, and the Croth delegate, for the first time in the session, did not look so certain of his grin. The man did not bow, did not ask for applause. He simply stood there, his presence filling the circle, waiting for what would come next. And in that stillness, it was clear that the laughter from before would not return so easily. The man stood in the center of the chamber with every eye upon him, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. His boots rested firmly on the polished floor, his hands still clasped behind his back, and though no weapon hung at his side, there was a sense that he carried something far heavier than steel. The silence stretched around him like a drawn bow waiting for the release of the arrow. When he spoke again, his voice carried clearly into every corner, steady and even, with no rush, no hesitation. "You want to know what humans are," he said, his eyes sweeping the curved rows of alien faces. "You think you already understand us, but you have only seen what we allow the galaxy to see. You have seen our trade ships and our schools, our cities full of light, and our smiling diplomats. But that is only one face of who we are." His gaze settled on the Croth speaker, holding there without blinking. "You mock our way of fighting because you believe war is only glory, only the thrill of the clash. You call yourself a warrior because you choose when to fight, because you walk into battle expecting to survive. That is not the same as fighting when the world itself is falling around you." The Croth tilted his head, but said nothing, his red eyes narrowing, his scaled fingers curling slightly against his arms. The other delegates leaned forward, the soft shuffling of robes and armor mixing with the faint hum of the translation drones overhead. The hall seemed to lean with them, pulled by the gravity of the man's words. He took a step forward, his voice dropping lower, yet somehow growing sharper. "When humans fight, it is not for sport. It is not for the taste of blood. It is because there is no other choice, because if we do not fight, we will lose everything. And when everything is on the line, there is nothing we will not do, nothing we will hold back. That is what you do not understand." He looked up at the great crystal dome where the stars shimmered beyond, a slow breath leaving him before he continued. "I remember a place called Black Ridge, a frozen valley on a world so far from here none of you have heard its name. The wind cut like knives. The snow was red before the first hour had passed. We were outnumbered 5-1. The enemy had higher ground and better weapons. By the second day, our lines had been pushed back so far that the snow beneath our feet was piled over. Bodies, friend and foe, together. The chamber was utterly still, the only sound his voice carried by the drones into the minds of every listener. We did not fight for glory that day. There was no one to cheer for us, no music, no banners, only the knowledge that if we fell there would be no one left to protect the settlement behind us, no one to carry the warning to the rest of our fleet. So we held, hour after hour, while the wind froze our hands to our rifles, while our breath turned to ice on our faces, while the ground shook under the bombardment. He stepped to the side, his eyes moving from one row of aliens to the next. We had machines, yes, we had weapons that could strike far, but when the enemy broke through, we fought them face to face, in the snow, in the blood, in the dark when the sun fell behind the ridge and the cold became so deep it felt like knives in the lungs. We fought until the barrels of our rifles glowed red and split, until the ammunition was gone and all we had left were blades. And when the blades broke, we fought. With the butts of our rifles, with rocks, with our bare hands. His voice tightened for the first time, not with anger but with memory. By the end of the third day, there were 12 of us still standing from the 80 who began. We could no longer feel our fingers or toes. Our eyes were so dry from the wind we could barely see. But when the enemy came again, we did not step back, not one step. And when our reinforcements finally arrived, they found us still in the line, still holding the ridge. The images his words painted hung in the air, vivid even to those who had never known snow, never smelled blood. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at the human diplomats who now watched the man with quiet pride. The Croth's expression had lost its easy amusement, replaced by something more guarded. The man's gaze locked on him again. That is what you do not understand about us. We do not fight because we enjoy it. We fight because there is no other way, and when we fight for survival, we will not stop until we have won or until we can no longer stand. And if we can no longer stand, we will still find a way to keep fighting. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the Croth speaker, his shadow falling across the podium. You speak of the warrior spirit as though it is measured by how loudly you shout or how bright your armor shines. But the spirit of a warrior is measured in the silence between breaths, when you know you may not live to take the next one. And yet you take it anyway, moving forward into the fire because you must. The Croth's claws twitched against the edge of the podium, his gaze locked on the man before him, the heat of challenge and the weight of doubt mingling in his eyes. The hall remained silent as stone, waiting to see what would come next. The man's voice softened but lost none of its strength. You should hope that humans never decide to fight you with everything we have, because if that day comes, it will not be for sport, it will not be for honor, it will be for survival. And when we fight for survival, there is nothing in the galaxy that can stand before us. He let the words hang, the silence stretching once more, heavy and unbroken, until it seemed the very air inside the great chamber had grown denser. The man did not look away, did not step back. And though no one spoke, it was clear that something in the room had shifted. The laughter from earlier had been replaced by something else entirely, something closer to respect, and perhaps even fear. The man stood in the circle of the council floor with the stillness of stone, yet his voice carried the weight of distant storms. He let his eyes move slowly across the gathered races, as if weighing each one before speaking again. The light from the dome above caught faintly on the scar that ran down his face. And in that moment, it seemed less a mark of pain and more a badge of something unyielding. When I was young, he began, his tone steady. I believed war was something that lived in the past, something that belonged to history books and the words of old soldiers. I thought the world had grown beyond it, that people could settle their disputes with talk and trade. And for a time I believed that was the truth. His gaze drifted upward for a breath, then came back down. That belief ended on the day the sky burned over Arcadia Station. A murmur rippled through the chamber at the name, some delegates shifting uncomfortably, others frowning as though trying to recall the record. Arcadia Station was a colony built in the shadow of two suns, the man continued. Its towers gleamed silver in the morning light, and its fields stretched green and gold across the plains. It was meant to be a place where many species could live together, humans and allies alike. A place of peace. The silence in the hall deepened as his voice grew lower. One night we saw the first fire in the sky. A single streak at first, then dozens, then hundreds. The alarms began to scream. The air shook, the ground shook. The sky became a storm of flame and falling metal. Ships were breaking apart before they could reach the ground. Some of them ours, some of them theirs. He stepped forward slowly, his hands loose at his sides. When the bombardment stopped, the air was thick with smoke and ash. The suns were hidden, and the heat of the fires fought against the cold of the night. We could hear the wounded calling out. We could hear the enemy moving in. The council chamber seemed to draw closer around him, the banners overhead swaying in the faint currents as if moved by his words. The first wave came fast. They moved between the burning buildings, their armor shining in the firelight, their weapons cutting through the streets like lightning. They were trained. They were prepared. They thought the chaos would break us. He took a breath that was almost a sigh. We met them at the east gate. We were only a few dozen, civilians and soldiers together. The smoke stung our eyes. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. The ground was littered with glass and twisted steel. We had no time to form proper lines, so we fought in the streets, door to door, window to window. Some of the alien delegates leaned forward, their eyes fixed on him, as if they could see the burning station in their minds. It was not clean. It was not glorious. It was not the clash of two proud armies meeting on a chosen field. It was fire and screams and shadows moving in the smoke. You could not always tell friend from foe until they were close enough to strike. The man's voice hardened. The enemy believed we would fall quickly. They had numbers. They had the advantage of surprise. But what they did not understand was that every person in that station had something to protect. Family, friends, the place they had built with their own hands. And when a human has something to protect, there is no retreat. There is no surrender. He stepped again toward the Croft, though his eyes never stayed fixed on any one being for long. We fought them back from the east gate to the main square. We fought with rifles until the barrels split, with pistols until the chambers cracked, with blades until the steel was chipped and bent. When the weapons failed, we used tools, pipes, broken pieces of wall, anything that could strike, and when our hands were empty, we used our fists. The Croft shifted slightly, but did not look away, the tension between them tightening like a wire. They kept coming, the man said, wave after wave, the fires spreading higher, the air growing hotter, and still we did not give ground. Not because we thought we could win, but because if we stepped back there would be nothing left to save. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. By the time the enemy commander called the retreat, the streets were red. The fires had burned half the station to blackened steel. The air was filled with the smell of smoke and blood. We had lost many, but the station still stood, and the people still lived. The man's eyes swept the chamber again. That is the truth you do not see when you judge us from your council seats. When humans fight, we do not measure victory by the number of enemies slain or the territory taken. We measure it by what we save, and if saving it means burning ourselves out to the last breath, we will do it without hesitation. The quiet in the hall was deep and heavy, as if the very air was holding its breath. Even those who had fought in wars of their own seemed to sit differently now, as if feeling the heat and the smoke from a battle they had never seen. The veteran's voice had drawn them into it and left them standing there beside him in the ruined streets. He straightened his back again, his scar catching the light, his shadow stretching long under the bright lamps of the chamber floor. We do not seek war, he said, but when war comes we remember every fire, every loss, every scream, and we carry it with us, not as a wound, but as a warning for ourselves and for those who think we are too soft to stand. The last words seemed to cut through the air like a blade, leaving behind only silence and the faint hum of the translation drones. The man stepped back just slightly, his expression calm once more, but the weight of what he had said remained, pressing down on every corner of the great hall. The man stood in the center of the great council hall, as though the ground beneath him was solid stone shaped for his feet alone. His eyes no longer swept across the chamber slowly. Now they held still for long moments on each delegate, forcing them to feel the weight of his attention. His presence was not loud, yet it seemed to fill the entire space more than the banners above or the bright lights that shone from the crystal dome. "When you speak of war," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you speak as if it is a contest, a test of skill between equals, something that can be won or lost, and then forgotten when the next season begins. But I have seen wars that are not contests. I have seen wars that are nothing less than storms meant to wipe away everything in their path." His gaze locked on the Croth delegate, whose claws now rested against the podium without their earlier confident tapping. "You believe humans avoid war because we are afraid. You believe we do not have the stomach for it. But the truth is far more dangerous. We avoid war because we know exactly what we are when the chains are broken." He stepped forward, and the guards at the edge of the chamber straightened, though they did not move to block him. "I was there at the siege of Icarus Station," he said, the name carrying a shadow through the hall, as though even those who did not know the story could feel its weight. "We were a small outpost on the edge of the frontier, meant to be a listening post for enemy movement. Nothing more. We were not built for a fight, not meant to hold against an army." He did not raise his voice, yet the words seemed to hit with the force of a hammer. "They came with 10 times our number, warships blotting out the stars, their weapons cutting through our outer defenses in hours. Every channel was filled with their demands for surrender. They promised mercy if we laid down our arms, promised safety if we opened our gates, and some among us wanted to accept." The man's hands shifted behind his back, fingers curling slowly. But surrender meant they would push through to the colonies beyond, meant that the families we had sworn to protect would face the same choice without warning. So we did not surrender. We sealed the gates. We prepared for a fight we knew we could not win. The tension in the room was so thick that even the translation drone seemed quieter. The first day, we held the outer ring, the enemy pounding at the walls with artillery until the ground shook. We returned fire with every weapon we had, every cannon, every rifle, every hand grenade. The air was so full of smoke that the suns above were nothing but red blurs in the haze. He shifted his stance, his shadow falling across part of the Croth podium. The second day, they breached the first gate and came pouring through. We met them in the streets, house to house, hallway to hallway. Every step they took cost them bodies, but every step we defended cost us our own. We fought until the floors were slick, until we were slipping in our own blood, and still we did not fall back. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was sharper. The third day, we had nothing left but close quarters. Our ammunition was gone, our heavy weapons destroyed. We fought with knives, with lengths of steel torn from the wreckage, with bare hands when nothing else could be found, men and women standing in doorways to block the enemy even when they had nothing left but their own bodies. Some of the alien delegates shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away from the veterans' unblinking stare. We were tired beyond anything you can imagine, our arms heavy, our lungs raw from smoke, our eyes so dry they felt like sand, but we kept moving, kept fighting, because we knew the moment we stopped, the moment we gave ground, the enemy would break through to the civilian shelters. He took another step closer to the podium, his presence pressing in on the Croth like the edge of a drawn blade. By the end of the 72nd hour, there were fewer than 20 of us still standing from hundreds. The streets were nothing but rubble and ash, the air so hot from fire and weapons that it felt like breathing molten metal. And still, when the enemy came for the last time, we met them. His eyes narrowed, his voice a cold current under the heat of his words. They expected us to fall at last. They thought exhaustion would break us, but something happens to humans when there is nothing left to lose, something we do not show in peacetime, something you cannot measure from council records or trade talks. We become relentless. A faint sound moved through the chamber. Not laughter, not whispers, but the uneasy shifting of bodies. When they saw we would not break, when they saw that even without weapons we would still come at them, they pulled back, not because they could not win, but because they realized the cost of winning would be more than they were willing to pay. He straightened again, his gaze sweeping the hall. That is why we fear war, not because we are weak, but because we know exactly what it unleashes inside us. We know the cost, not just to our enemies, but to ourselves. We know that once we begin, we do not stop until the fight is finished. His voice grew softer, yet more dangerous. If you call that weakness, then you are making a mistake you will not live to correct. Because if the day ever comes when humanity chooses to fight with nothing held back, it will not be a contest, it will be an ending. No one moved, no one spoke. The air in the chamber was still and heavy, as if the walls themselves were listening. The Croth delegate held his gaze with visible effort, the earlier smirk long gone, replaced by a tension in the set of his jaw and the slow curl of his claws into his palms. The man let the silence stretch, knowing it would speak louder than any final line. Then, without another word, he turned slightly, as though ready to step back, yet the weight of his presence remained, pressing down on every mind in the room like a shadow that could not be shaken. The man stood in the center of the chamber, and the silence around him felt like a living thing pressing in from all sides. The banners above did not sway. The faint hum of the translation drones seemed to have faded, as though the machines themselves were unwilling to interrupt the moment. Every pair of alien eyes fixed on him carried the same question, yet none dared to voice it. The Croth delegate who had mocked him earlier now shifted his weight in slow, uncertain movements, as if the platform beneath his feet had become unstable. The claws that had once drummed with arrogant rhythm were now tucked in close to his palms, and his eyes no longer gleamed with challenge, but with something harder to name, a deep, unsettled awareness of the man before him. The veteran let his gaze pass slowly from one side of the hall to the other. He saw the pale-faced representatives of the Illyrians with their silver skin rippling faintly, as though moved by a wind only they could feel. He saw the stone-faced Seracle, whose heavy frames usually radiated unshakable calm, but now carried a stillness that spoke not of peace, but of being held motionless by the gravity of what they had heard. He saw the Andron who lived by trade and negotiation, now leaning forward, slightly as if they feared to miss even a breath of what might come next. When he finally spoke, his voice was not raised, yet it reached every corner of the chamber with ease. You called us cautious. You called us slow to anger. You called us unwilling to take the hard path of battle. And you used those words as if they were insults, as if they proved weakness. He took a step forward, each movement unhurried, but steady as the sound of a heartbeat. Now you have heard the truth, and you understand that our caution is not born of fear, but of knowledge. We carry scars that never fade, memories that do not loosen their grip no matter how many years pass. We avoid war not because we cannot fight, but because we know what happens when we do. The air in the chamber seemed to tighten as he continued. In war there are no victors, only those who have lost less. We have learned this through the fires we have walked through, fires we lit ourselves when we thought the only way forward was to burn everything in our path. A faint ripple moved through the delegates, but no one spoke. Even the council chair, who normally would have called for order, kept his hand still. The veteran's presence had drawn every thread of attention and bound it to his words. When we fight to end the fight, not to prove a point, not to claim a prize. And when that end comes, there is nothing left to rebuild, because we leave nothing standing behind us. He let those words settle before speaking again, his tone slower, colder. I do not want that for you. I do not want that for anyone in this chamber. I have seen what it is not just to cities and worlds, but to the minds of those who survive. There are wounds that no healer can mend and no peace can ease. The Croth delegate finally shifted enough to speak, but the words caught in his throat before they could form. His jaw closed again with an audible click of teeth, his earlier certainty now replaced with something far heavier. The man's eyes met his for only a moment, and in that look there was no malice, only a deep and unshakable warning. The veteran's voice dropped lower, but somehow grew even sharper. If you want to test us, if you want to see what happens when humanity is pushed too far, then remember this moment, and ask yourself if you are willing to pay the price. Not just in your soldiers, not just in your ships, but in your homes, your skies, your histories. He drew a slow breath, each second stretching long. We have fought enemies stronger than you, faster than you, with weapons you cannot yet imagine. And we're still here, not because we were lucky, not because we were protected, but because when we decide that something must be done, we do it until it is finished, no matter the cost. The chamber was so still that even the shifting of a robe or the faint scrape of a chair leg felt like an intrusion. The delegates seemed frozen in a moment they did not want to break, as if they feared that any movement would draw the full weight of the man's attention upon them. He let his eyes pass over the room one last time, then spoke again with words that felt like they would stay etched in the walls themselves. Understand this: if peace is kept, humanity will be your ally. We will trade, we will share, we will build together. But if you seek to bring war to our door, then know you will not be fighting for victory, you will be fighting to survive. With that, he stepped back slowly from the center of the chamber, the echo of his boots on the polished floor sounding louder than before. Not because the sound had grown, but because the silence around it had deepened even further. He turned toward the great doors at the far end and began to walk away, each step measured, unhurried, yet carrying the finality of a closing verdict. The guards by the doors stood stiff as stone, their eyes following him, but their bodies unmoving. No one tried to stop him. No one called after him. The chamber behind him remained caught in that heavy pause, the air thick with words left unsaid and thoughts that would linger long after the doors closed. When the great metal panels swung shut behind him, the sound rolled through the hall like distant thunder, and still the delegates did not speak. It was as if the man's presence remained in the room even in his absence, a shadow that clung to the edges of their thoughts and refused to be pushed away. The Croft delegate stared at the floor for a long moment before looking up toward the council chair. His voice, when it finally came, was quieter than anyone had heard it before. Perhaps we should reconsider our position. No one argued. No one interrupted. The council chamber that had once been filled with posturing and quick retorts was now a place of careful breaths and slow measured words. The lesson had been heard, and more than that, it had been felt. The chamber remained silent long after the doors had closed behind the veteran, and in that silence every delegate seemed to feel the same thing, though none dared to speak of it. Yet a strange heaviness hung in the air, not the heaviness of fear alone, but something deeper and harder to name, something that clung to the bones and pressed against the heart. The council chair shifted in his seat as if to speak, but paused, his eyes moving across the room from face to face, reading the subtle changes etched into expressions that only moments ago had been sharp with debate and now were softened with unease. Even the Croft delegate, who had been loudest in his mockery, sat in stillness, his claws tapping once against the table before falling still again, his eyes unfocused, as though replaying the veteran's words again and again. Across from him, the Illyrian envoy, with skin that shimmered like liquid silver, tilted their head slightly, and finally spoke, their voice slow and careful, as though each word was being weighed before release. He did not speak to threaten us, the envoy said. He spoke to tell us the truth, and it is a truth that burns. No one disagreed. The Serical war chief, who had never been known to show doubt, leaned forward, placing both massive hands upon the table, his deep voice rolling through the room. If even half of what he says is true, then to provoke them would be to invite the ruin of entire worlds. He paused, his heavy brow furrowing. I have seen civilizations fall, but never have I heard such certainty in the voice of one man. The Andran trade master, whose life had been built on deals and bargains, cleared his throat. And he did not speak like a politician, the trade master added. He spoke like someone who has walked through fire and come out carrying the flames with him. He looked around the table. You cannot fake that kind of truth. A murmur ran through the chamber as some nodded in agreement, yet the weight of the warning kept the sound low and brief. The Croft delegate finally lifted his gaze, and there was no trace of arrogance left, only a slow, deliberate tone. We mocked their spirit for war because we believed it weak to hide from battle, he admitted, but now I understand they hide from battle because they know it too well. He exhaled slowly, his breath shuddering. And perhaps we should learn from that. The council chair's gaze sharpened. Then are we agreed that we will not push humanity to the edge, he asked, that we will step with care when dealing with them? One by one the delegates gave their answer, not with loud declarations, but with small firm nods, each one a quiet acceptance of a truth. They could not ignore. The chamber seemed to exhale as a whole, yet the air still held the echo of the veteran's presence, as though the walls themselves remembered every word he had spoken. Far beyond the council chamber, the veteran walked through the long hall toward the docking bay, the echoes of his boots on the metal floor steady and unbroken, though inside his chest there was no sense of triumph, only a familiar emptiness that came after such moments. He had not come to frighten them. He had come to stop something before it began, and he hoped that he had succeeded, though he knew hope alone was never enough. At the bay, a young human aide waited stiffly, unsure whether to speak. The veteran stopped beside him and gave the smallest nod, which seemed to ease the younger man's nerves. The aide finally asked in a voice that trembled slightly, "Do you think they will listen?" The veteran's eyes moved to the view beyond the docking bay doors, where ships moved like silver insects against the dark void. "They will listen for now," he said, his voice low, "but memory fades and pride returns, and when it does they may forget what they heard today." He paused. "That is why we must be ready, always ready." The aide nodded, though the weight of the words seemed heavy upon him. They boarded the shuttle in silence, the hum of the engines rising as the ship lifted from the bay and turned toward the cold scatter of stars. Back in the council chamber, the delegates began to speak again, but now the tone was different, quieter, more measured. They spoke of trade, of treaties, of shared research, but each plan was now shaped by a new caution and a new respect for the species they had once mocked in their minds. Each of them saw not only the face of the man who had stood before them, but the shadows of the wars he had described, wars they now prayed they would never see. The Croft delegate remained seated long after the others had gone, his mind replaying the line that had struck deepest of all, the man's warning that in war there were no victors, only those who had lost. Less, it was a truth the Croft had never accepted before, but now he could feel it settling in his bones like a cold weight he could not shake. In the corridors outside, aides and staff moved quietly, their voices hushed, as though they too had been touched by the strange tension that lingered after the veteran's visit. Whispers spread quickly, some claiming the human had spoken like an ancient warrior king, others saying he had spoken like a grieving father. All agreed that something had changed in that room, even if no one could yet name exactly what it was. In the weeks that followed, messages were sent between worlds, treaties adjusted, fleet movements reconsidered, though no one ever wrote it in official records. The reason for these changes was always the same, the image of a lone human veteran standing in the heart of the council chamber and speaking with a voice that carried the weight of whole worlds behind it. And though time would pass and the sharpness of the moment would soften in memory, the core of it would remain a quiet understanding buried deep in the minds of those who had heard him, a reminder that peace was not weakness, and that the ones who avoided war were often the ones most dangerous to provoke. Some would tell the story in whispers, others in speeches. Some would twist it for their own ends, but somewhere far from the council worlds, the veteran would live out his days in quiet places, never seeking to be remembered, knowing that the warning he had given might be enough to keep countless worlds from burning. And for those who had heard him that day, the sight of his calm eyes and steady voice would never fade, and the echo of his words would rise unbidden whenever the thought of war returned, reminding them that to wake the spirit of humanity in battle was to call down a storm that could not be stopped once it began.